On the night of May 7th, 2022, just hours after a beautiful wedding ceremony in Tallahassee, Florida, a 911 call shattered the calm of a quiet neighborhood. Gunshots, screams, and then silence. Police arrived to a scene soaked in confusion and blood. A newlywed groom slumped lifeless in his living room, his mother lying in a pool of blood at the doorstep, and a missing bride no one could account for. Surveillance footage would later capture a familiar figure leaving the scene. A man dressed not in shadows, but in celebration. A pastor, a best friend. Someone who had stood beside the groom as he exchanged vows earlier that same day. The story that would follow left detectives and the community stunned. A decades-long friendship, poisoned by hidden lust, betrayal, and obsession. What began as brotherhood ended in bullets, and what should have been a honeymoon turned into a manhunt. The question that echoed for days wasn't just why he did it, but how a man trusted with scripture and souls could carry out such deliberate evil, in the name of love or something far darker. You're watching True Crime's Corner, where we uncover the crimes that hide in plain sight. If this story unsettles you, let it remind you that betrayal can wear a trusted face. Share this video to raise awareness, and subscribe so these stories never stay buried. Because sometimes evil isn't in the shadows, it's in the pews, at the altar, and even in the arms of those we call family. Before the bullets and betrayal, before the headlines and handcuffs, there were just two boys, Dwight Ellis and Davis Brenton, both freshmen at Florida State University. They met in the fall of 2013 during campus orientation. Two students from vastly different backgrounds, but drawn together by a shared desire to create something better for themselves. Davis had enrolled in the university's Real Estate and Urban Development program, aiming to follow in the footsteps of his late father, who had built a modest property portfolio before dying of pancreatic cancer when Davis was 17. Dwight, on the other hand, had arrived with less certainty. He started in social work, later shifting into religious studies. His early life had been marked by abandonment. Dwight rarely spoke of his family, and when he did, it was vague. A mention of moving through group homes, of being placed in foster care by the age of 9, of learning to survive on what he called scraps of kindness. The contrast between them was stark. Davis had a mother who called every evening to pray with him, who sent care packages stuffed with snacks and handwritten notes. Dwight had no such support. On holidays, he stayed behind in the dorms while others returned home. When Davis invited him to spend Thanksgiving at his house in Tampa that first year, it was the beginning of something deeper than friendship. Davis's mother, Vanessa Brenton, welcomed Dwight without hesitation. She cooked for him, made sure he had clean clothes, asked about his classes. What began as a simple act of kindness turned into routine. Soon, Dwight was staying with them for most breaks, and by sophomore year, he was practically part of the family. Their friendship was more than convenience. They studied together, attended student ministry meetings, and often walked the campus late at night, talking about their futures. Davis dreamed of owning a firm one day, something clean and professional. Dwight talked often about purpose, about helping people, about being called to something greater. He had a strong presence, a natural charisma that others gravitated toward. Professors described him as insightful but intense. He was articulate, confident, and when he discovered preaching during a student-led prayer night, something seemed to shift. He began referring to himself as anointed, and while some saw it as bold, Davis never questioned it. He believed in his friend, but not everything was smooth. In their third year, An incident quietly passed through student affairs. A report that Dwight had gotten into a heated altercation with an elderly campus security guard who allegedly asked him to move his car. The situation was quietly resolved after Dwight claimed it was a misunderstanding, but whispers lingered. A few students said the guard was shoved. Others said they saw Dwight screaming. No charges were filed, and it disappeared into the background. What remained constant was Davis's loyalty. Even when he landed a competitive internship during junior year and began taking fewer classes with Dwight, the bond didn't break. Dwight would still visit the Brenton home during weekends. Vanessa continued to treat him as a second son. Neighbors sometimes assumed she had two boys. They did everything together: vacations, church conferences, and birthday celebrations. After graduation, Davis Brenton's life followed the path many would call conventional. He accepted a full-time offer from the real estate firm where he had interned, settled into a condo near downtown Tallahassee, and began building his portfolio with quiet discipline. Within 2 years, he had closed a dozen property deals, earned a mid-level promotion, and was seen as a future partner by his colleagues. He was steady, reliable, and careful in his approach to both life and business. Dwight Ellis, however, moved with less structure. He didn't pursue full-time employment. Instead, he began identifying himself as a pastor, though he had no official ordination or church assignment. He started a YouTube channel, preaching from his living room. He visited local fellowships, guest speaking with fiery messages that blended scripture with personal testimony. He called himself a man refined by fire, often referencing his foster care background and faith journey. For a time, his charisma brought modest attention, and small groups began to invite him regularly, but it never evolved into something consistent or financially sustainable. Despite this, Dwight rarely acknowledged struggle. He dressed sharply, borrowed Davis's old car, and lived with rotating roommates in low-rent apartments on the edge of town. When asked about money, he gave spiritualized answers, quotes about ravens being fed by God, or Elijah being sustained in the wilderness. In truth, he relied heavily on those around him, and especially Davis. Davis never publicized the support he gave Dwight, but it didn't go unnoticed by those close to him. Still, there were fractures forming beneath the surface. Dwight's relationships became increasingly short-lived and volatile. His first post-college relationship with Carissa, a nursing assistant he met at a church event, ended abruptly after 3 weeks. She later told a close friend that Dwight pressured her into sexual acts that left her bruised and bleeding, under the claim that spiritual intimacy demanded full surrender. The incident was never reported, but Carissa withdrew completely from the church circle they shared. Dwight dismissed it as a misunderstanding. His next relationship with Julian lasted longer, about 2 months, but ended just as sharply. Julian worked as a youth coordinator at a local Christian center. She described Dwight as manipulative and emotionally controlling. According to her later affidavit, he discouraged her from making independent financial decisions, repeatedly asked her to reroute her paycheck to a shared ministry fund, and criticized her for being too career-focused. She said he used scripture to shame her when she resisted. The breakup was bitter. She blocked him. He retaliated by preaching vague sermons about Jezebels sent to drain the spirit. People noticed. Davis, by this time, had grown slightly more vocal. Friends say he encouraged Dwight to apply for more stable pastoral opportunities, to at least consider seminary or church placement through recognized organizations. Dwight rejected the advice. He insisted that he wasn't called to be just another church employee. He described himself as set apart, destined for something greater than a pulpit. Davis didn't press. He valued peace, and perhaps felt guilt for his friend's past. Samaya Jones entered Davis Brenton's life just as his career was hitting full stride. They met in early 2020 when Samaya relocated from South Carolina to Tallahassee for a marketing role at a regional lifestyle brand. She was vibrant, articulate, and sharply confident, qualities that made an immediate impression not just on Davis, but on everyone in his circle. Within weeks of closing a home purchase deal for her, Davis invited Samaya to dinner. A quiet romance bloomed, and within months, they were inseparable. What most never saw beneath the surface was the complexity that shaped Samaya's personality. She came from a deeply religious family background, the youngest of 3 daughters raised in a tight-knit Pentecostal home. Her mother had passed during her late teens, and though she often spoke of her as a guiding light, those close to Samaya said her grief shaped her into someone who craved stability, identity, and spiritual affirmation. Despite working in marketing, she maintained a strong connection to the church, volunteering with youth outreach and attending weekly services. Davis introduced her to his mother, Vanessa, not long after they started dating. Vanessa approved instantly. Samaya was poised, respectful, and seemed genuinely invested in Davis's growth, both professionally and spiritually. Their relationship moved with quiet momentum, and by the end of the year, Davis proposed during a small dinner with close friends and relatives. As their wedding preparations began, one unexpected presence in their relationship was Dwight Ellis. As Davis's lifelong friend, it wasn't unusual for Dwight to be close during such a significant time. But as Samaya grew closer to Davis's inner circle, her interactions with Dwight became increasingly frequent. He checked in when Davis traveled. He sent long text messages filled with scripture and spiritual encouragement. It appeared, at least externally, that Dwight had taken it upon himself to ensure Samaya was spiritually prepared for marriage. At first, she resisted and distanced herself slightly from Dwight. But Dwight's presence remained. Nothing about her demeanor raised alarms. To outsiders, everything appeared picture-perfect. The wedding date was set, the guest list finalized, and Samaya posted occasional joyful updates on her social media accounts. Her bridal shower, hosted by Vanessa, went smoothly. Yet behind that image, something was unraveling. Dwight had positioned himself as more than a friend, and Samaya, caught between loyalty, confusion, and a spiritual authority she once trusted, was being pulled deeper into a web that had nothing to do with marriage and everything to do with control. According to messages retrieved by investigators, the first signs of an inappropriate relationship between Dwight Ellis and Samaya Jones began in the final quarter of 2021, roughly 8 months before the wedding. Surveillance data pulled from phones and encrypted chat apps later revealed that Dwight had begun reaching out to Samaya under the guise of spiritual mentorship. Their communication grew in volume and intensity. What initially presented as counseling eventually crossed boundaries of formality and friendship. Witnesses familiar with Samaya's routine shared that she had started visiting Dwight's apartment alone, under the explanation of premarital prayer sessions. Davis was reportedly unaware of the frequency and nature of these visits. Phone records and calendar entries confirmed repeated meetings, some of which occurred late in the evening, often lasting over an hour. In group settings, their demeanor remained composed. No one reported overt signs of intimacy. However, a former neighbor of Dwight's later told detectives she had once seen Samaya leaving the building through a side entrance well past midnight. Forensic analysis of Dwight's devices uncovered multiple deleted images and texts later retrieved from cloud backups. The language in these messages, though at times veiled in religious tone, revealed an escalating emotional and physical relationship. Phrases like, "You are the flesh God set apart for me," and "Ours is a deeper bond than the world can understand," were frequently used. Investigators confirmed through time-stamped exchanges that the sexual component of the relationship had begun at least 6 months prior to the wedding. Digital records also revealed that Dwight had sent Samaya small sums of money via cash apps, often accompanied by coded messages. These transfers were flagged not because of the amounts, rarely exceeding $50, but due to their frequency and the context. Samaya's own statements during initial questioning indicated that Dwight would often position these as gifts of obedience and signs of favor. Samaya's internal conflict was documented through a series of voice notes she had recorded on her private phone, one of which was later recovered during the investigation. In one of these entries, dated February 2022, she expressed confusion over her involvement with Dwight, stating she felt manipulated by the idea that he was sent to save her from herself. She also mentioned fear of breaking off the relationship, citing concerns about disappointing both Davis and the church community. Church leadership had not been aware of the ongoing situation. No formal complaints were filed, and Dwight continued to participate in services and community events without disruption. In fact, records showed he was invited to deliver a guest sermon just 2 weeks before the wedding, one that focused on the theme of loyalty and spiritual covering. At no point during this period did Davis suspect the extent of the betrayal. Investigators noted that Davis's digital calendar remained consistent, with entries for venue appointments, registry coordination, and guest list confirmations. His phone logs reflected regular check-ins with Samaya and Dwight, maintaining what appeared to be trust on all sides. But behind the illusion of pastoral guidance and premarital counsel, something deeply corrupt had taken root. And by the time Vanessa's concerns began to escalate, the damage had already been done. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Vanessa Brenton was said to have been unsettled. As someone who had built her life around careful observation and maternal intuition, she knew when something didn't sit right. Her son, Davis, had always been transparent with her. They shared a bond strengthened by years of surviving loss, rebuilding after the death of Davis's father, and anchoring their lives in a quiet Florida suburb. But lately, Vanessa had started noticing patterns, subtle but consistent. Vanessa confided in her closest friend, Mavis Lott, a fellow church elder. Mavis would later tell investigators that Vanessa had considered confronting Davis directly, but feared adding strain to his already busy wedding preparations. Instead, she chose to remain watchful. She made a quiet habit of checking in on Samaya, texting her late in the evenings and asking about her day. Samaya's replies grew shorter. Some went unanswered. The night before the wedding, Vanessa went to bed uneasy. According to Mavis, she had expressed a deep dread that something about this union felt rushed, even wrong. Still, she showed up early the next morning, wearing a tailored plum-colored dress and a nervous smile. Photos from that day show Vanessa seated in the second row, flanked by members of the Brenton family, eyes fixed on her son as he exchanged vows with a woman she no longer fully trusted. But can we always trust a prayerful and caring mother's instinct? Maybe, yes. In the days leading up to the wedding, tension between Dwight and Samaya reached a breaking point. Just 24 hours before she was set to walk down the aisle, she revealed something that changed everything. She was pregnant. And it wasn't Davis's child. According to later reports, Dwight told her there was nothing to worry about. He would handle it. God doesn't bring people this far to shame them, he assured her. But his definition of handling it was something far darker than Samaya could have imagined. As the wedding went on as planned, Dwight had already made a decision. He wouldn't allow Davis to unknowingly raise his child. He wouldn't let this baby be born into a life where he had no control. He reached out to Samaya just hours after the reception, telling her he had something special to give them. She didn't know it then, but that night, Dwight wasn't bringing a wedding gift. He was bringing death. The events that unfolded on the night of May 7, 2022, began with celebration and ended in bloodshed. Hours after exchanging vows at a small but elegant ceremony, attended by family and close friends, Davis and Samaya Brenton returned to their home in a quiet Tallahassee neighborhood. Guests described the day as joyful and uneventful, marked by laughter, music, and heartfelt speeches. Photos captured smiles, toasts, and embraces, none revealing the storm that was about to break. Davis had reportedly planned a quiet evening with his new wife. The couple had chosen not to leave for their honeymoon until the following week, opting instead for a weekend of rest and reflection. Unbeknownst to him, Dwight Ellis had already set a different plan in motion. Based on GPS and phone records analyzed during the investigation, Dwight left his residence shortly after 10:30 p.m., carrying what authorities later confirmed was a legally registered firearm. His movements placed him en route to the Brenton residence, arriving shortly before midnight. It was not an unannounced visit. Samaya had received a message earlier that evening, investigators confirmed, in which Dwight claimed he had a special gift he wanted to deliver to bless their union. There was no indication that Davis was informed of this plan. Surveillance footage from a nearby home showed Dwight's car pulling into the driveway at approximately 11:42 p.m. Less than 10 minutes later, the first 911 call would be placed by a neighbor reporting loud gunshots. Inside the home, forensic evidence painted a grim and chaotic picture. Davis was found in the living room, slumped over the arm of the couch. He had been shot 5 times, 4 in the chest and 1 grazing the side of his neck. The pattern and angle of the wounds suggested that the shots were fired at close range. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds, and no evidence that Davis had expected or resisted the attack. Authorities concluded he was caught entirely off guard. Samaya was not harmed during the shooting. In fact, according to later interviews, she remained in the house while the incident occurred. Whether out of shock, coercion, or fear, she made no attempt to flee or alert authorities. In her eventual confession, she admitted to allowing Dwight entry, knowing he was armed, and believing that he had no real intent to cause harm. Investigators would later challenge that claim, pointing to her earlier knowledge of the pregnancy and Dwight's promises to handle it. What investigators did not anticipate was a second victim. As Dwight moved toward the front door, reportedly urging Samaya to pack a bag, the unexpected arrival of Vanessa Brenton changed the situation. Vanessa had come alone, without warning, intending to drop off a symbolic gift for the couple. Her vehicle was seen arriving at the home just minutes after Dwight's. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds. According to eyewitness accounts and ballistic reports, Vanessa came face-to-face with Dwight at the door. A verbal exchange occurred, brief and heated. 2 shots were fired at close range, striking her in the head and upper neck. Her body was found at the doorstep, the gift bag beside her. Forensic teams later confirmed she had not even entered the home. The immediate aftermath was brief. Dwight and Samaya fled the scene in Dwight's vehicle. The gun was never recovered. Neighbors called 911. Officers arrived within minutes to find Davis and Vanessa deceased, and the house in disarray. Crime scene tape was up before dawn. The calm of a wedding day had become the chaos of a double homicide, and the man who had once stood at the altar beside Davis as a best friend was now the prime suspect in his murder. The manhunt for Dwight Ellis and Samaya Brenton began just before dawn. By the time the forensic team had completed its preliminary sweep of the Brenton residence, Law enforcement had already reviewed neighborhood security cameras and extracted images of Dwight's vehicle speeding away from the scene. The make and model were identified within hours, a dark-colored 2015 Dodge Charger with minor damage to the rear bumper. License plate recognition systems flagged the car just past the city limits by 1:27 a.m. The couple's disappearance triggered a multi-agency alert. Both were classified as suspects. Samaya's last known cell phone ping had come from a tower just outside Jefferson County. Authorities believed they were heading east, possibly toward the Georgia state line. Detectives proceeded to interview multiple witnesses, including Samaya's former co-workers, who expressed shock but noted she had grown increasingly distant in the weeks before the wedding. Several confirmed that she had mentioned being tired of pretending and that things weren't what they seemed. One even recalled an instance where Samaya mentioned a man of God wanting to save her from the wrong marriage, though no names were stated. The turning point in the investigation came from a motel clerk at a roadside lodge in Madison County. Reviewing surveillance footage, authorities identified Dwight checking in under a false name shortly before 3 a.m. on May 8th. Samaya was seen following him into the room 10 minutes later. The car was parked behind the building, out of view from the main entrance, an attempt at concealment that ultimately failed. Officers closed in at approximately 9:12 a.m. The couple was found inside the room. Dwight was reportedly lying on the bed, fully clothed, with the television playing at low volume. Samaya was seated near the window, holding her phone. Neither resisted arrest. In his initial statement, Dwight remained silent, refusing to speak or answer questions. Samaya, however, began to cry almost immediately. According to officers at the scene, she kept repeating a single phrase: "I didn't think it would go that far." During transport, Samaya provided her first official statement, admitting that she had known Dwight was armed when he visited their home that night. She acknowledged that they had been involved in an intimate relationship and that she had told Dwight about her pregnancy. When asked why she didn't warn Davis or attempt to stop Dwight, she gave no definitive answer, only that she felt trapped between two versions of herself. Forensic examination of the motel room uncovered Davis's wedding band in a paper bag near the trash can. A check of Samaya's phone revealed deleted messages and encrypted voice notes between her and Dwight, later recovered through digital forensics. One recording, dated 2 days before the wedding, included Dwight saying, "I'll take care of everything. Trust me. God wouldn't bring us this far to shame us." The discovery of that message, along with the physical evidence and Samaya's partial confession, cemented their involvement. Both were formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and tampering with evidence. The trial date was set for late October 2023. Public reaction was swift and visceral. Vigils were held outside the Brenton home. Church members expressed disbelief. Former supporters of Dwight's ministry took to social media to denounce his actions. Photos from the wedding began circulating alongside crime scene images, and the narrative that once celebrated the strength of friendship now unraveled into one of betrayal, manipulation, and the devastating price of unchecked obsession. The trial of Dwight Ellis and Samaya Brenton began on October 23, 2023. Prosecutors opened with a methodical breakdown of the timeline leading to the murders. They played the 911 calls, displayed surveillance stills of Dwight's vehicle leaving the Brenton home, and presented digital forensics, retrieved texts, voice messages, and metadata that established not only premeditation but also manipulation. The prosecution argued that Dwight had exploited his perceived spiritual authority over Samaya and preyed on her emotional vulnerability to orchestrate the murders. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a forensic audio enhancement of a deleted voice note found on Samaya's cloud backup, in which Dwight stated, "When this is done, no one can question what's meant to be." Though he never explicitly mentioned violence, the statement, paired with timing and events, bolstered the argument that the murders were not spontaneous but calculated. The prosecution brought forward witnesses who testified to Dwight's influence over Samaya and his long history of financial dependence and failed relationships. Carissa and Julian, two of Dwight's former partners, took the stand under subpoena. Their testimonies painted a consistent picture: a man who used religious language to coerce, control, and conceal his true intentions. Their experiences with Dwight lent critical context to his pattern of emotional dominance. Samaya's defense, led by a seasoned public defender, leaned heavily on her mental state. They argued that she had been groomed over months, slowly pulled into a psychological dependency that clouded her judgment and rendered her unable to act independently. They introduced excerpts from therapy records and statements from family members describing her as deeply conflicted, increasingly withdrawn, and spiritually confused. They portrayed her as a secondary victim, someone used and discarded in a delusional scheme. Dwight's defense, on the other hand, was sparse. He refused to testify. His legal team argued that he acted out of passion, not premeditation, citing emotional instability brought on by feelings of abandonment and betrayal. The jury was not swayed. Multiple forensic experts testified to the calculated nature of the killings, noting the deliberate positioning of the weapon, the number of shots, and Dwight's escape plan, all pointing to intent, not impulsivity. When Samaya finally took the stand, the courtroom was silent. Her testimony was measured, but emotionally weighted. She admitted to her involvement with Dwight, described the moments leading up to the murders, and broke down when recounting the gunfire. Her voice cracked as she recalled Vanessa arriving at the house and the look on Davis's face before he was shot. She stated she froze, too afraid to move, too ashamed to intervene. Her remorse was evident, but for the families of the victims, it changed nothing. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just over 6 hours. On November 15, 2023, both Dwight Ellis and Samaya Brenton were found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Dwight to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Samaya received a sentence of 30 years, with eligibility for parole after 22, taking into account her cooperation and diminished culpability. In the months following the sentencing, the ripples of what happened on that wedding night continued to shake the community. Davis Brenton, once known as a steady, disciplined man with unwavering loyalty to both his family and his faith, became a symbol of stolen potential. His funeral drew hundreds: friends, colleagues, fellow churchgoers, and even strangers who had followed the case. Tributes flooded in from those who'd closed home deals through him, from community leaders, and from youth he'd quietly mentored over the years. His mother, Vanessa, was laid to rest beside him, her casket draped in lilac, her favorite color. The ceremony was held in the very church where she had once sung in the choir. The pain of losing both Davis and Vanessa within moments of each other left a lasting mark on those who loved them. Dwight Ellis remained behind bars. He received no further visitors after his sentencing. According to prison officials, he declined all media requests, spoke little, and spent most of his time in solitary reflection. Samaya Brenton eventually began therapy as part of a state-mandated rehabilitation program. Though no formal statement was ever released, sources within the facility described her as subdued, mostly quiet, and often seen reading religious texts alone in the common area. Reports indicate she struggled with anxiety and disassociation. particularly in the weeks after the trial. Her name, which once appeared on wedding invitations, church programs, and workplace rosters, faded from public memory. Emily Parsons, one of Samaya's childhood friends, later told a local podcast that the tragedy was a reminder of how far manipulation could reach, especially when cloaked in spiritual language. "It wasn't just murder," she said. "It was betrayal that grew in silence. People trusted Dwight with their hearts and their homes, and he twisted that into something none of us saw coming." To this day, questions remain. How long had Dwight been planning this? What did Samaya really believe in those final hours? Could anyone have stopped it? The story of Davis and Vanessa's murder didn't end with a courtroom verdict. It left a void, a quiet absence that still echoes in the community they helped shape. The town didn't just lose two people. It lost its innocence, its sense of discernment, and its belief that some lines couldn't be crossed. And in the end, the people who looked most righteous, the ones closest to the pulpit, proved that sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones told in God's name. You've just heard a story that reminds us how betrayal often hides behind familiar faces. If you believe these stories matter, if you believe the truth deserves to be known, share this video. Someone out there might need to see it. Subscribe to True Crime's Corner for more real-life stories that reveal what's often hidden behind closed doors. Let's expose the darkness together.